Hello, RoahmMythril here once again, getting back to RoahmMythrill 3, and it's time for the judge commentary for the last two stages of Tier 2 that we just went through. Starting with 160th place, Trouble in the Fortress by Zeta. 33.4 out of 100, this stage had 11.2 in design, 6.6 in fun, 3.2 in creativity, 3 in aesthetics, and 9.4 in functionality, with no penalties. Mick, 27 out of 100. There's really not a whole lot to say about this. Gameplay-wise, it's simple enemy encounters interspersed with a whack-ton of gas cracks. That's a sentence. It has a few enemies here that I don't always see, namely Glooper. I'm gonna guess that's the frog. But the individual encounters are so bare bones that it undermines any potential creativity present. The only time it breaks from this bare-bones design is the boss fights, by which I mean the weird and mildly broken mid-boss of Suzak and Whopper. Add on the aesthetic design, which is just the beta tile set with a bright blue background, and the whole level is just sorta there. I do remember encountering a dev kit crash here once, but when that's all that sticks in my head, that's not really the best indicator of quality. I'd advise something more involved for the next round. Shinryu, 13 out of 100. Sorry, nothing. Shinryu didn't even show up for class picture day. And while I'd rather not leave my review as a short joke, this is one instance where I feel my hand is being forced. This is mainly because there's really not much to say about this stage. The only semi-notable thing I feel is worth mentioning is the double mini-boss with a Whopper on one side and a misaligned Suzak on the other, which causes the fight to break. I didn't encounter the fight breaking, so I wonder if that's something else that got fixed for the game build. Otherwise, this is an incredibly bare-bones level with very basic room and enemy layouts. There's not much more to it than that, unfortunately. Patchy, 38 out of 100. Like an afternoon's work, very lackluster. Default tile set and single color background make the stage look really dull and uninspiring. Enemies don't really combine with the stage layout or with themselves. They're all kinda just there, not really posing any real threats. Some okay use of the Waveman steam, but it's too basic as a primary gimmick of the stage. You can skip the entire upper portion in the token room. I'm trying to think of the layout of that room, and yeah, I think come to think of it, you can. The Ringman mini-boss isn't even looking at your direction most of the time. Someone ought to teach them about manners. Boss is just a standard fight with Honey Woman. Don't know why she's there unless she was the mastermind all along behind the whole Fortress takeover plot. But she's just a cute little bee. We've seen the dangers that bees can pose. Flashman 85, 44 out of 100. Sure, I'd love to playtest your clearly still in progress level. Obviously you'll need to add some background graphics and swap out the default dev kit tileset, as competently used as it may be, for something resembling a fortress. The premise falls flat without the aesthetics to back it up. It's also hard to tell what's a bottomless pit and whether the nice-sounding, slightly quiet music actually fits the intended atmosphere. In terms of gameplay, the level is off to a decent start. A few introductions might catch the player off guard, particularly the water spouts, but most are fine. I'd like to see a couple power-ups, even though the average player won't need them, more focus in the asset selection, several things are used once and then forgotten, and more deliberately shaped challenge arcs. The second encounter with an asset is usually easier than the first. No complaints about checkpoint placement or level length. Challenges tend to be spaced too far apart and lacking in complexity. More inconveniently placed water spouts, like the one on the second Gachapon screen, would inject some urgency and trickiness into these largely unremarkable challenges. Diagonal water spouts could be really interesting if used outside the decently hidden token room. The best parts of the level are when hazards corral the player into tight situations, like the batons at the end, or the mini-boss fight, which despite the steep learning curve for newcomers, works better than it has any right to. The level is absolutely playable, but one text box and a consistent gimmick are the only things giving it a sense of direction. If you bulk up the challenges, re-examine the difficulty progression, and update the graphics, then you'll be in good shape for another round of playtesting before submission. And A-Spark, 45 out of 100. Not too much to say here. I would describe this level as an inoffensive, simple level that desperately needed a different tile set. The gameplay did not have much challenge to it, and I would have liked to have seen the gimmick pushed a little further. But despite these issues, the end result was a playable, and sometimes that is a success in itself. Clearly this is the work of a beginner, and the level shows some understanding of the basics. There were a couple of specific issues which held the level back. The tile set used is meant for testing and not for finished levels, so needed changing. Some of the enemies are only used once, where more focused levels will pick a few enemies and use them repeatedly. The Phoenix mini-boss was placed incorrectly and ended up in the floor, and the Whopper was facing the wrong way. Finally, the steam wasn't introduced well, and it comes as a surprise in a way that can damage the player, where ideally gimmicks are introduced in a safer manner. A second pair of eyes would have spotted most of these issues straight away, so make sure you get your level checked in the future. Overall, I would say this was a decent level, but yeah, it does feel like it was maybe somebody's first attempt, which hey, as a first attempt, it isn't that bad. Definitely some more work needed to be put into the aesthetics, more cohesive tile sets to give the feeling that you're in a wily fortress, since that's the conceit of the stage. But overall, fairly decent, but it could have definitely used some polish. Because I think that's kind of something we're running up against now, is stages that, on their own right, they're pretty decent, they just need that polish. So next up we had 159th place, Wilys Redemption by Shiny. 33.6 out of 100. It had 9.2 in design, 6.8 in fun, 4 in creativity, 6.6 in aesthetics, and 7 in functionality, with no penalties. Mick, 29 out of 100. Alright, credit where credit is due. The up and down warning signs are beautiful, and I want 100 of them airlifted to my house pronto. This also has concepts like the fire-ice split path, and the weird flying weapons archive, and some very odd music for Hanabiran. Last time I checked, it's a flower, not a devil jester clown. But it's such a good song. Sadly, that's the most praise I can offer. Even with concepts I don't see that often, this level is boring. The new flying weapons archive is just a tedious bullet sponge. If you mash the fire button, they'll rarely hit you. And less common concepts are waylaid by some incredibly dull level design. The ice section is just mini-bosses and standard enemy challenges, whereas the fire section is change keys, a broken mid-boss, and ineffective lasers. All in all, it's unimpressive at best. The end game is not an improvement. If anything, it's the opposite. For starters, a boss corridor with no boss, which is a boring anticlimax. The second element tries to be interesting with the keys, even as it makes you play the entire level twice. But not only are the keys needlessly annoying and difficult to get, even with the hints, that massive build-up ends with another missing boss. I get it. Programming a boss is difficult and time-consuming. I needed to ask for help with mine in the Magmemel 2 days, but with a good 50-plus dev kit bosses freely available, this should have ended with something, not another nothing. Shinri, 36 out of 100. If there's one thing I can commend this stage for, it's the up and down warning sign. It's a nice way of giving a heads up to the player and keeping them alert for an enemy type that's notorious for its cheap shot potential. Unfortunately, that's where most of my praise ends. When you get down to it, there's really not a whole lot to this level. A majority of the room layouts are incredibly basic, with very little in the way of actual challenge. The closest it ever gets to being interesting is when the split path is introduced, but even then, it doesn't amount to much. The ice path is a long corridor lined with a few minor enemies and a mini-boss at the end. The fire path is slightly more engaging, but not by much. It also starts with a Suzak and Phoenix fight, which is thrown off completely thanks to their misaligned positioning. Seems like a lot of people had problems aligning Suzak and or Phoenix. The Hanabiran mini-boss earlier in the stage also suffers from a similar issue, given he pops up in thin air over half the time. I get that he's probably supposed to be appearing on the junk piles in the background, but it really doesn't work thanks to his sprite size staying the same. While that would have been the end of it, there's also a secret area to contend with. Accessing it is a bit of pain, however, given you need to collect 2 of the hidden keys in a specific way. You need to use Magnet Beam to cross the gap leading to Hanabiran, collect the key, get back to the other side of the gap using Rush Bike because the ceiling is too low to make the jump otherwise, go back to the previous room, then climb down a ladder hidden in the floor to get the other key. If you don't do this, you end up being short 1 key by the end of the stage. Personally, I don't think there's any good reason as to why this whole process needed to be so obtuse. On top of that, I wouldn't really consider the secret area to be worth it either. It's more interesting than the main level, but all it really boils down to is a string of randomly assorted gimmicks and mini-bosses, ending with a big room full of nothing. I get that time constraints are a thing, but literally anything else would have been better than ending it like that. Patchy, 39 out of 100. Wily's Turning Point? This stage was built in a way to be something very grand right in the name itself and the pumped-up, energetic music, but unfortunately the end product just fell flat. Felt very underwhelming, sorry to say. A few issues I have with the stage are regarding its lack of focus. For instance, there isn't a consistent enemy gimmick roster. Many of the things throughout the stage just come and go. It should have stuck with one gimmick or two and expanded on it, creating gradually more difficult challenges involving them to test the players of their mastery with the gimmicks. Another problem is that a lot of the architecture of the stage feels very bare bones and boring. Most of the challenges involve going through a few screens of flat geometry or simple pit jumps with very little variation, and dealing with mini-boss fights in unchanging terrains after each part. The idea of key hunting for a bonus area is neat. However, two particular keys, second and third ones, are very annoying in the way you have to collect them in order, due to how the screen transitions were set to prevent backtracking. The second key is especially bad for requiring you to make it over a low ceiling gap forward and on the trip back, or else you're forced to redo the stage again just to be able to get to where the third key is located. The poor grammar and text formatting with the dialogue boxes aren't helping the stage's case either. The Wily Archive enemies are really odd. They only ever show up at the beginning of the whole stage. They're extremely durable, but also very unthreatening due to their slow speed. Thanks to their large health pool, they also contribute to the annoyance of the key hunting due to the aforementioned key obtaining issue forcing you to start the endeavor over for each failed attempt. Yeah, I was definitely feeling that. I think the tedium was getting to me. Though I do like the cute little warning signs for whenever you come across pits with up and downs in it. A nice little heads up for the player to prevent from being cheap-shotted. The extra area is honestly not much better, with the problems from the main portion being still prominent. The few screens it offers there are simply not very interesting to go through, even after realizing that they are themed around each of the main series Mega Man games to the extent the dev kit can provide via second playthroughs. And finally, no bosses for both the main and extra partitions put the stage into very anticlimactic ends, even more so for the extra area since there was such a huge build-up towards it. If you were running out of time, at least put a dev kit boss or two in it, still. Wrong button. I'm very tired. Flashman 85, 37 out of 100. I want a level that tells a story. The story I'm getting here is that the level has no idea what it wants to be, and that you were fresh out of apostrophes when you wrote the level name. So I've smashed together 5 unrelated levels, loosely connected them with a theme of things popping out of pits, missed some details like lava collision and proper mini-boss orientation, added an irritatingly precise and prolonged scavenger hunt, and finished with a big dramatic build-up to nothing, which might be funny if the player understands the level's scattered sense of humor. The soundtrack, nice as it may sound, is stylistically all over the place. Enemies and gimmicks are haphazardly introduced and promptly discarded. Whole screens are totally empty for no reason. The secret area is so far removed from the feel and format of everything else that its mere existence hurts the level. I'm not sure how anything has to do with Redemption, unless the junk area is a recycling center where Wily redeems cans for cash. Look, I know what it's like to have more ideas than will possibly fit into one level. The secret isn't making the level longer. It's exercising restraint and saving some ideas for later. I'll tell you what works. The interesting tile work within each section, the courteous warning signs heralding the pit poppers, hints about the key locations, the general concept, if not the execution, of finding and carrying multiple keys to the end of the level, the uniqueness of the archive stack enemy, regardless of its glitchiness and underuse, the flower mini-boss, the frequency of checkpoints and power-ups, the fact that most challenges are adequately fair, if not consistently novel or engaging, once you know what's going on. Scale back, focus, and playtest extensively. Then, there'll be some redemption. And A-Spark, 27 out of 100. Oh, this got played way earlier in judging. Why didn't I make any notes? Key Quest! Ah, that. I remember this now. Who needs notes? Well, I'm out. Heck, go read Shin's review. He'll have plenty to say. So, yeah. Definitely, it seems like the main point of ire for a lot of players, some of the judges, definitely was the thing for me, was getting that second key and getting back out to get the third key. It was way more obtuse than it needed to be, and I definitely feel like that hurt this level for me, especially just how many times I failed, went through the gap, fell down where Hanabiran was, couldn't get the third key, had to restart, had to go through all the weapons archive stacks and enemies again, which, honestly, I don't think they really provided much of interest, just due to the fact that they are total bullet sponges. So, if anything, having to go past them again and again and again and again, because there isn't a checkpoint like right at the start of the fortress area, it was just an exercise in tedium that, honestly, I was definitely starting to zone out by the end. And yeah, the fact that both ends are just, here's a room with an element, there's no real climax to it, no boss to fight, honestly did feel a little bit disappointing. Like, all that build-up, I felt like there should have been something, especially with a stage called something as grand as Wilys Redemption. It definitely felt like something should have been there, but there were just empty rooms. I do feel confused by the name, admittedly. Overall, the idea is sound, but yeah, should have been scaled back a little bit, and definitely the key hunt should have been a bit less obtuse than it was. But with that, thank you very much for watching, I hope you're enjoying the series so far, and I shall see you again next time. Until then, fare thee well. And rock out! This tier still has good music.